G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we are looking at my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Australian Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So as is the case with these videos, I typically take a look at all the headlines in the lead up to the upcoming Grand Prix. We'll pick up chip strategy, chip usage, and whether or not something needs to be considered for this race. And then we'll revisit my team selection dilemmas and final thoughts on my lineup ahead of Australia. But first things first, Carlos Sainz has been the biggest headline in Formula One pretty much since the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix concluded. Very well documented that Ollie Behrman deputized in his place with an exceptional P7 on debut. So a real great result for Ferrari, all things considered, given Sainz was out for that race, undergoing appendicitis. So it seems to me as though Sainz will return in Australia. Nothing has been confirmed at the time of recording, but I fully expect we will hear an announcement from Ferrari, perhaps on the Thursday prior to practice on the Friday. Now, I think regardless of whether or not Sainz starts for Ferrari, in fantasy terms, I still think that makes Ferrari constructor alone a very exceptional asset to own. I think they represent very good value. We've seen great results and they are the clear-cut second best car after Red Bull. I think for a lot of people who are agonizing over whether or not to bring in Behrman, subject to what the news is on him, I think for 15 million, he still is very good value and represents enough upside if you're chasing price increases, assuming he starts for Ferrari. But for a lot of teams, given the budget constraints at the moment, there just doesn't seem to be enough room to wiggle him into our teams, given that we may have a premium driver like Perez or Leclerc in that first slot, and a lot of us are moving in the direction of doubling up on two premium constructors if you're not there already. So I think for Behrman, a lot of value. If you want to chase price increases, I think he is a very good pick, assuming he starts. But if Sainz does make a return, which I think is perhaps quite likely, given we saw Albon return after a 3-week layoff between Monza and Singapore of 2022, I think he could be a very handy differential at the 2x DRS boost slot. Perez and Leclerc are understandably going to be favourites because they've had back-to-back P2s and P3s respectively. But Sainz is someone that can win races and can finish on the podium in a car that looks exceptionally competitive and reliable out of the gate. So if you're leaning towards taking a little bit of a punt, I think Sainz could be that guy if he ultimately does return for Ferrari. In addition to that, given he's slightly more affordable than the likes of Leclerc and Perez, you could use that couple of extra million left over to upgrade, make a marginal upgrade on a part of your team, like say Valtteri Bottas, Logan Sargent, in favor of someone like a Haas driver in Magnussen or Hulkenberg, who are both delivering very reliable points production and seem to also see the odd 0.5 million increase week to week. So I think if you're really considering a differential 2x DRS boost punt, then Sainz is your guy. Right now, I'm still leaning towards a Perez or a Leclerc, but I think regardless of the decision you make, Ferrari constructor is my pick of the bunch for Australia. Mercedes, on the other hand, seem to have experienced a number of problems and consistency concerns through two races that we perhaps weren't expecting from them this early in the season. There was no means to suggest they would be the best team from the get-go, but it seems as though they are still grappling with some issues as to how they want to take the car development forward. It sounds to me as though they are going to experiment with the setup a little bit in Melbourne, just to understand a little bit more about what works best for the car and give them a direction as to where they want to take it moving forward. Lewis in particular has really struggled through two races. He was even outperformed by Ollie Behrman in Saudi Arabia. Part of that probably has to do with the car, but I'm not going to take anything away from Ollie's drive there. He's had 12 and 6 points fantasy-wise through two races. So not a great start for Lewis. On the other hand, George has fared slightly better. He's picked up P5 and P6 in his first two. So by no means groundbreaking results for Mercedes, and I think they are going to aspire to want to see a little bit more from the drivers and the car. But if you had to pick any Mercedes asset, the Mercedes constructor is probably my pick. You're getting two Mercedes drivers for the price of one, but unless, of course, you're strong-armed into picking Mercedes. I think Ferrari offers slightly more value at the moment at 0.4 less. And considering how much stronger the SF24 has been through 2 races, the kind of decision makes itself for me. Now, if they're experimenting in Melbourne, I think we could see Mercedes go one of 2 ways. Firstly, they look streets ahead of the rest of the teams chasing Red Bull at the top. George and Lewis look like P3 to P5 kind of drivers, and they rediscover the form that they were really hoping they'd see from the first couple of races of the season. Or secondly, they languish in the bottom part of the top 5 constructors. They continue to struggle and score points, more than a handful of points every race that we've kind of seen so far. I'm not trying to be too optimistic about Mercedes. I think they will get it right, but I do suspect it's maybe a couple more races away until we see the true colors of that car shine through. Now, I definitely think they will remain competitive. And if you're running a team that doesn't have Red Bull constructor in there, you're going for a 2 premium. I like McLaren and I like Mercedes as 2 constructors to pair with Ferrari. It again depends on budget constraints because we know McLaren is slightly more dear than Mercedes. But if they can get their act together, the Silver Arrows, I think they can remain relatively good value for money, even though we maybe haven't seen it yet so far this season. I think for me, there's still a wait and see, a couple more races, as I said. But if by China, Japan, Miami, for instance, they're looking a little bit more consistent and reliable and they've caught up to Ferrari and Red Bull, then I think they may well enter the template, both for the drivers and constructors. But I think for Australia, unless we see something in practice that blows us away, they're a wait and see for me. Now, Alpine have been another team that have been a bit of a mixed bag in terms of fantasy through 2 races. We all know how poorly that car has performed. Gasly obviously had that DNF in Saudi Arabia within 2 laps of the race starting. He was an extremely reliable driver throughout 2023. He only had 1 DNF all year, which was one of the best among all drivers on the grid. But now he's had 1 in the first 2 races of 2024 in a car that looks shockingly off the pace. To the contrary, Ocon has had a pretty solid start fantasy-wise through 2 races. He's averaging 7.5 points per race, which I certainly think is well above and beyond what I expected the Alpine would produce in terms of fantasy production. They still haven't scored any points yet, and I think that's probably to be expected given how slow that's looked. But I think what's helped by them, reliability concerns aside, which is something that is important in F1 fantasy, is the fact that they are typically qualifying quite low through the 2 races we've seen so far. Gasly and Ocon locked out the back row of the grid in Bahrain and then finished P17 and P18 in Saudi Arabia qualifying. So given they seem to be locking out 1 extra row every race week so far, does that mean they lock out P15 and P16 in Australia? I'm not so sure, maybe, but I still think they are a Q1 car at best, and it makes the 2019 Williams look like a Lockheed Jet at the moment. So I think we may well see reliable fantasy production from Gasly and Ocon if they aren't going to finish with DNFs, but that reliability in terms of the car itself is something I'm still not entirely convinced on. If I had to pick between the 2, and I was entertaining Ocon in my team selection video earlier in the week, but that would purely be down to the fact that he hasn't DNF'd in 2 races. Those 2 in a vacuum, I'm probably leaning Gasly at the moment, only because of the fact he's experienced price decreases, whereas Ocon seems to be a little bit overvalued at the moment from back-to-back price increases after his 7 and 8 points through 2 races. The problem is, again, with reliability and if that car is actually going to last the full race distance. So I think for me, Gasly is a slight enabler in comparison to Ocon because of his price point. If they are going out in Q1, as we'd expect perhaps in Australia, then I think that makes both of them somewhat attractive. But I need to see a bit more consistency and reliability from the car itself before I'm jumping at either driver. I may well take a punt on one in Australia, but I wouldn't say I'm anywhere near convinced yet. So I want to wait and see. It might be another race or 2 before I seriously consider getting one of them into my team. But we did see what happened in Australia last year on the last lap of the race. So let's just wait and see again, as was the case with Mercedes too. But I don't necessarily think if they can get to the end of the race that they're bad picks because of how poorly they qualify. In terms of chip and team strategy for the race, there isn't really much that speaks to me in terms of deploying a chip in Australia. Now, I've got here the DNF disqualification and not classified history on the screen in Australia since 2014, which seems surprisingly high to me. Now, last year we saw what happened on the last few laps of the race where it was absolute carnage. And I definitely don't think that's going to happen again this time around. Now, I'm quite surprised DNF rates in Australia are so high because we tend to see the attrition increase as the season wears on, where there's more engine reliability problems, failures, that kind of thing, and the odd crash or two more than usual because there's more at stake as we get closer to the end of the year. But I think given how high these DNF rates seem to trend in the last 10 years or so, or the last 8 races or so, it is higher than I probably would have given it credit for. Now, again, I'm not saying I'm going to absolutely use no negative in Australia. I probably won't. But this is something to think about given it is a street track hybrid type circuit. And I find that those can sometimes lend itself to more risk in terms of getting to the end of the race. So there's certainly a case to be made for the no negative at Albert Park. I'm not so sure I want to deploy this chip this early in the season, but there are areas of the track where there's grass, where there's gravel, where you can easily run off and put your car at risk. So I would kind of approach with caution the kind of drivers you're bringing into your team. I would avoid those higher risk drivers like Logan Sargent, maybe even like Yuki Tsunoda, who can be quite erratic at times. Just look at those experienced and proven commodities that are just going to get the car to the end of the race, because a -20 at this time of the season, and I had this in Saudi Arabia, can really hurt your rank. Stroll killed me in Saudi Arabia. So just proceed with caution. And if you think it's going to be high risk, if we see a few crashes in practice, then maybe it is time to activate it. But I think there is also a case to be made to leave no negative until later in the year. I wouldn't really recommend any other chips at this stage of the season. I think all of the more powerful chips, Limitless, Extra DRS, are best used at or around sprint races, or once we have a much better idea of what the rest of the field looks like, Red Bull aside. So I would hold station on using any other chips right now, but there have been a number of you that have already deployed both the Extra DRS boost and the Limitless chip through 2 races to get that immediate rank gain. But I think as the season wears on, those people that remain patient and deploy those chips at the optimal times will no doubt be able to catch up. So I want to also look at how my team is shaping up for Australia. So I find that there's probably a couple of different builds to go with, but right now the one that stands out to me is the Red Bull Ferrari double up in the constructors department. Unfortunately, that probably means I have to bin off Max Verstappen, who has been the most consistent fantasy driver through 2 races. It is going to be difficult to part ways with someone who scored 81 points in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, but it makes the most sense for my team, given Perez is only averaging 10 points less per race. So it is probably the decision I go with for this race, but in doing so, I've also intentionally rolled a transfer from Saudi Arabia into Australia to counteract the possible budget inflexibility I've had. So for me, I think Ferrari Constructor, as I've talked about, becomes an obvious pick for me, regardless of whether Sainz or Behrman starts for them. As I mentioned before, Perez, probably given his form through 2 races, back-to-back P2s, does instill me with confidence. He's also had a couple of price rises, and at 13% is also a very handy differential to own. A lot of people who have made those exceptional rank moves early on in the season have probably had Perez or Leclerc in that DRS spot with these 2 guys at the bottom here. So that, by taking out Stroll, who seems probably the most obvious make way for me, gives me 10.4 to play with. I'm not looking to spend all of my money in one hit. I think I might bide my time. I'm not looking to take -10 transfer hits from the off. So, I talked about Alpine. That's perhaps an option. I wonder if Esteban Ocon is slightly overvalued. He might be, he might not. But I like Joe, even though he had a rotten start in Saudi Arabia with that crash in practice, that -5 for not setting a time in qualifying and then starting at the back, still managed to claw his way a little bit back until he was obviously sidelined by that extremely slow pit stop. So, had it not been for that -5, he would have come away with a 3 points at the very minimum, if not even a little bit more for those extra positions gained. So he's potentially one driver I'm liking. We know how good he is with the overtakes. And he just seems to have a little bit more life than, say, Bottas, who I may end up running one more week. I know he's had a pretty average start to the season, but I'm not taking -10s for budget drivers. There's just nothing to suggest that makes any sense at all. There's no case I can really make, given a -10 is more often than not going to be more than what the actual budget driver scores on any given race weekend. So Joe could be one option. I could look at potentially Nico Hülkenberg. He had that great race in Saudi Arabia, obviously helped by the train conductor Kevin Magnussen holding up a quarter of the grid. So I think the reliability of both Hulk and K-Mag, they're both very experienced drivers. And I think even though Hulk can tend to qualify a little higher than his teammate and then lose the odd position here and there from what we saw last season, the Haas has also shown it's got a lot better tire wear and they're able to hold station or even make passes during the race as opposed to completely falling back in the field as we saw 12 months ago. So Nico could be a pick there. There's also potentially, as I mentioned, room for a Haas driver, an Alpine driver like Pierre Gasly. So he could potentially slot in there. That would give me enough wiggle room to maybe upgrade Bottas in a subsequent week. But again, I want to have a team that I'm feeling comfortable about, and Gasly I'm not so sure if I'm entirely sold on as of right now. I'm not so sure I'm jumping at either RB. They are a team that just seems to have underwhelmed a lot through 2 races, and Tsunoda and Ricciardo are going to typically qualify between P10 and P14, I think, and they kind of just sit there the whole race. They might even lose the odd position or so, and that's just not what you want for your drivers under 10 million. You want them to typically qualify as far back as possible, make those overtakes and positions gained, and for a driver like Tsunoda, for instance, that's going to more often than not get into Q2 and just kind of sit there the whole race and not score any points, it's not really enough to incentivize me to go with him for this weekend. So that's kind of where my head's at right now. I'm leaning Hülkenberg, Joe, maybe Gasly. There's not really much else to pick, unfortunately, at this price bracket when you're going for a 2-pronged premium constructor build. If in the off chance I think Leclerc looks much better, then I could go for him here. That would give me 12.1, and I could ultimately then leave Stroll in that final slot. If I think he's going to be worth a points finish, that would give me 1.1 then to upgrade Bottas to Joe. And I could do something like that. But I'd really want to see a lot from Charles before I ultimately pull the trigger on him. I think Perez so far has shown he's got a handle on that Red Bull this season and looks to be a lot more comfortable than the kind of mixed bag of results we saw from him in the second half of 2023. But that's kind of where my head's at right now, guys. I'm going to be back with FanAmp on the fantasy formula with Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ for another deadline stream. This will be slightly earlier than usual because of the fact that deadline in the United States for me is going to be around midnight. So given that a number of you in Europe and the UK will be asleep at that point and will be quite late in the United States, we're going to bring it forward to my afternoon, evening in the US, late evening in the UK and Europe. But all of those details will be on my Twitter page for when we're streaming live then to react to Free Practice 1 and Free Practice 2. So be sure to drop by for any last minute questions. We can answer all of your team selection dilemmas, and there'll be prize giveaways as they usually are every deadline stream. So drop in for that to say hello to Adam and I. We'd greatly appreciate it. But I think I'll leave it there for now, guys. If you don't hear from me again before the race weekend, good luck with your teams this weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.